When I tell you a little bit about this last chapter, it's shorter than all the other ones, by the way. It's shorter, and I think it's more succinct, and when I was writing it, I just have to watch out for the speaker so you don't get a lot of feedback. When I was writing it, I was praying specifically for ideas and metaphors to illustrate what had been going on in the book as a whole. And they came. They came. I'll tell you when I get to a given section what the metaphor was and actually how long it took me to write it. Because it was just as though the Lord was saying, get this right, and the ideas were just there for me as I was writing. Because the last chapter of a book, as you know, is really important, just as the first chapter of a book or the introduction is really important. A lot depends on it. So what I was trying to do is just tie everything together, and as it turns out, in 20 pages, which when you're a writer seems awfully short.
No, it is short.
It is.
It is short.
So anyway, I titled the chapter, Count It All Joy. And it begins like this. We spend hours together learning how to practice a different way with Jesus. By God's grace, in the future, we'll continue to trace his footsteps, keeping in step with him, no faster and no slower. Every once in a while, I'll give you a look. That's important. No faster and no slower. Jesus graciously offers his shoes to us. Now, picture yourself walking with Jesus. He's at your side. As you travel, you begin to notice warning signs along the path. Jesus points to these markers, every one warning of misery if followed. And this image of misery markers in spiritual formation came immediately to me as I was praying. And then what the misery markers are just flowed out in about 5 minutes. So we'll get to them. Screwy ideas and wacky practices in spiritual formation cause immense misery. We've seen, for instance, that distorted views of God disrupt and distort our spiritual formation. Dysfunctional views of God birth a spiritual life from hell, not from heaven. You remember some of those dysfunctional views of God? God is a distant, demanding parent with a voice that sounds like Norman Bates. If you remember the movie Psycho, his mother. Norman, you're not getting it right. I know what you're thinking, Norman. That voice. So these are key misery markers, and that was the metaphor that came to me, because the whole book is about walking on a different way with Jesus, on pilgrimage with Jesus. So ponder with me other misery markers of sick spiritual formation. These are some of them. Sick spiritual formation lacks joy. It's fueled by effort rather than the grace of God. It's self-centered rather than God-centered. It relies on technique rather than relationship. It constantly takes its own temperature. How am I doing? How am I measuring up? It concentrates on tasks rather than gifts, doing rather than receiving. It pictures the spiritual life as duty to God rather than delight in God. It's exhausting. It tires us out. It tries and always falls short. It's shaped by distorted images of God and of ourselves. All things we've talked about, huh?
Yes.
It's apt to judge others for their sins and shortcomings. Wow, that's a lot of misery. And then the next section has to do with counterfeit spirituality, because what I've just read in terms of these misery markers is what characterizes counterfeit spirituality. I got the line counterfeit spirituality from a 16th century bishop in Geneva named Francis de Sales. I guess here in the States you say de Sales, and it's Francis de Sales. So anyway, counterfeit spirituality, just tuck that metaphor away. Counterfeit spirituality discourages, drains, and dries us out. It withers us. We grow old and withered before our time. It characterizes people whom Dallas Willard describes as, quote, unfeeling, stiff, unapproachable, boringly lifeless, obsessive, and dissatisfied. That'll wake you up. Now think of Jesus. Not one of these words fits him, does it? Jesus unapproachable, boringly lifeless? Hardly. Now here's the thing about something that's a counterfeit. A counterfeit looks like the real thing. Like a counterfeit dollar looks like the real thing. This is the reason we have trouble distinguishing a sick spiritual life from a healthy one. Francis de Sales, a kind, direct, sensible coach on the spiritual life, encourages us to set a firm, wise foundation for our life with Christ. Get things right at the beginning, Francis encourages. Quote, since little faults committed in the beginning of the project grow infinitely greater in its course, and finally are almost irreparable, above all else you must know what the virtue of devotion is. Here's what he says. If we know what genuine devotion is, this is me commenting and then we'll get to Francis. If we know what genuine devotion is, we'll be much better prepared to pursue it wisely and safely, and more skilled in identifying its counterfeits. What is devotion? Francis's answer is simple and clear. Genuine, quote, genuine living devotion presupposes the love of God, and hence it is simply true love of God. Love for God and love for neighbor are the means and goal of healthy spiritual formation. That's where we start. That's where we set up camp. Every spiritual discipline, and we've talked about 5 of them, every spiritual discipline in some fashion develops love in our life. If it doesn't, we're practicing it poorly or may need to set it aside for a while. We don't pursue a different way with Jesus to become experts in spiritual disciplines. We don't pursue a different way to become theologically well-informed. We don't pursue a different way to practice silence, solitude, or simplicity for its own sake. We don't pursue a different way to learn how to pray. We pursue a different way with Jesus to develop and nurture love for God and love for our neighbor. Every spiritual discipline we studied in this book trains us in how to love well. Now think about these different disciplines we've taken a look at. And think of them as means of grace God uses to grow our ability to love. Let me say that again. The spiritual disciplines are means of grace God uses to develop our ability to love. So if you're practicing these disciplines and find that you're not expanding in your ability to love, stop. Go back to the beginning. Think of the disciplines then as the trellis or scaffolding for supporting and facilitating love's growth in our lives. Can you see that metaphor? See that image? There's a scaffolding. There's nothing more than the scaffolding. The vine growing up the scaffolding is love itself. Sometimes you need to rebuild the scaffolding if we get to the construction project wrong at the beginning. Francis witnessed plenty of counterfeit spirituality in his day. So he was in the 17th century in Geneva. He worried that, quote, everyone paints devotion according to his own passions and fancies, end quote. Some folks are quite disciplined, but their discipline is fruitless. Their character remains barren and loveless. Stop. Go back to the beginning. One person, Francis comments, is very strict in her fasting, while her heart, quote, may be filled with hatred. Another is scrupulous about his drinking habits, quote, but won't hesitate to drink deep of his neighbor's blood by detraction and gossip. Still another, quote, thinks himself devout because he daily recites a vast number of prayers. But after saying them, he utters the most disagreeable, arrogant, and harmful words at home and among his neighbors. Nice to see that people really have the same problems back then that we have today. Another gladly, Francis writes, takes a coin out of his purse and gives it to the poor, but he cannot extract kindness from his heart to forgive his enemies. Spiritual phoniness marks the people Francis describes. Isn't spiritual counterfeiting a skill we've all learned? We detect its presence when the gold of our lives fails to support the currency of our words. Quote from Francis, many persons clothe themselves with certain outward actions connected with holy devotion, and the world believes they're truly devout and spiritual, whereas they are in fact nothing but copies and phantoms of devotion. Imagine a ghost. Looks like a real person, but there's nothing there. He's a gentle man, but every once in a while he throws a bucket of water in your face to bring us to our senses. Spiritually. So the next section is no tricks and techniques. Please remember this. No tricks and techniques to get spiritually healthy and mature. No tricks and techniques. This is Thomas Merton. Do you remember this? I said, do you recall Thomas Merton's advice on the slow pace of spiritual growth? Remember that? The slow pace of spiritual growth and our tendency to try to speed things up. A good coach will slow us down if we're willing to listen. This is Merton. Quote, anyone who is trying to deepen his or her life of prayer will need a good dose of humility and docile acceptance of sound advice. For in the spiritual life, quote from Merton again, there are no tricks and there are no shortcuts. Those who imagine they can discover spiritual gimmicks and put them to work for themselves usually ignore God's will and his grace. The last thing we want to do, Merton counsels, is to place our confidence in ourselves and whatever natural abilities God may have given us. This is Merton. One cannot begin to face the real difficulties of the life of prayer and meditation unless one is first perfectly content to be a beginner. That's tremendously freeing. To be a beginner and really experience oneself as one who knows little or nothing and has a desperate need to learn the bare rudiments. We'll spend most of our lives learning the bare rudiments because we're little image bearers, little creatures with very small minds the size of a thimble. Those who think they know from the beginning will never, in fact, come to know anything. So in our slow journey traveling with Jesus on a different way, gladly assume the posture of a beginner. We don't want to get ahead of ourselves or Jesus. Know that we're all apt to overestimate our capabilities. Let's grow our self-awareness and become more attuned to where we're apt to be self-deceived. The last place we want to get imprisoned is in ourselves. We don't want to be beginners, Merton writes, but let us be convinced of the fact that we will never be anything else but beginners, and that's absolutely fine. I hope you're smiling. Such good news. I don't have to be an expert. I can be released from the burden of trying to impress other people. Isn't that nice? Actually, I repeated myself. I quoted that very quotation earlier in the book, and Harper Collins said, "You did this earlier. Do you want to do it again?" And I said, "Yep." So we get some coaching from Antony. Antony the Great was one of the great desert dwellers. These folks who headed out to the desert in Judea, in Syria, and Egypt from late 2nd century on. He was the great one. So a little coaching, just for a moment. Antony the Great, perhaps the greatest of the desert dwellers, the monastic friends we spent time with in this book, and you have, was well aware of our tendency to try to speed up our spiritual growth, to bite off more than we can chew. Ever do that? To bite off more than we can chew. Anthony understood that God's precious image bearers will experience stiff opposition, both within themselves and from external forces. He speaks freely, if you're following along on 272, he speaks freely of the devil's attempt to run Christ's image bearers off the road of sensible spiritual perspective and practice, sometimes by tempting us to practice an extreme, oppressive, exaggerated spirituality. Satan tempted some desert dwellers to live their lives with God, Anthony teaches, in a punitive, unreasonably harsh way. Some monks, for instance, were tempted to spiritual competitiveness. If word got out that one monk was sleeping only 4 hours a night, neighboring monks might try to make it through the night on 3. How surprising and counterintuitive to discover that Satan might tempt us to pray, fast, or work beyond our capabilities. That's Anthony coaching. The demon's tactics are subtle and relentless. Quote, "They do these things for the sake of, they do not do these things," got to get this right, "they do not do these things for the sake of piety or truth, but so that they might bring the simple to despair and declare the discipline useless. So if you're practicing given discipline and you find yourself getting discouraged, this is going nowhere, it might be because of this kind of attack. Maybe we just need to lay it aside for a while. So imagine a young monk who's recently joined the community and is just beginning his journey with God. He looks around at his brothers and is impressed. Some he observes are able to pray for hours on end. Others go without food for extended periods of time. Then there are monastic masters like Antony, whom many call the Great. So what does our young, immature monk do? He tries to pray or fast or work beyond his ability. When he comes to his senses, he realizes he needs rest, sleep, food. Then the demons attack. Oh no, God wants you to pray. God wants you to fast. How can you think of stopping? Don't disappoint God. Don't disappoint yourself. And what would others think if they saw you resting and eating? Keep up the good work. You can pray for at least another hour. Surely that. See how subtle that is? If our young monk hears these demonic voices, he'll end up discouraged and disillusioned with himself and God. The devils know this. Exaggerated, harsh, competitive practices harm rather than help. A good end, practiced in a foolish way, gets us nowhere. Anthony coaches us to walk before we can run. Small, consistent steps add up. Small, consistent steps add up. Repetitio mater studiorum. Small, consistent steps add up. Know yourself. Acknowledge your weaknesses. God is patient. He doesn't ask us for more than we can give. Instead, Jesus slowly and gracefully increases our ability to give to him and to others. And by his grace, there comes a time when we can give much more. We'll grow, but genuine growth can't be rushed. Remember a story I told you about? I was a little guy in Phoenix and planted some seeds and wanted to know what was going on under the ground. Surely those carrots should be up by now. And I still remember in the backyard digging them up, and they were just coming to life. Even the feeling then I felt, I remember. Now, one of the great dangers for us today, we're going to move soon into a more positive frame of mind. One of the great dangers is distraction. Distraction, simple as that, and as serious as that. I asked Richard about this, Richard Foster, and he's also written about it in a revised edition I mentioned here on bottom of page 274, a revised edition of Celebration of Discipline. He noted that his perspective had changed since the book was first published in 1978. Quote, this is the more recent Richard Foster. He's now 81. This is the old Richard Foster. There is one major difference that has occurred in the past 40 years that does indeed impinge on the spiritual life. I can state it in one word: distraction. Distraction is the primary spiritual problem in contemporary culture. Oh, for the day when all we had to do was turn off the television if we wanted silence and solitude. Now we click through an endless stream of internet links, write daily blogs, read tweets from God knows who, check our emails constantly, text family and others, and mindlessly scroll through Facebook, end quote. Now that's a master of the spiritual life talking. It's a master of the spiritual life. He really is. And if he's concerned like that, best to pay attention. Distracted people, now this is me, much lower down the rung. Distracted people have a difficult time identifying and attending to what's genuinely important. They are habitually diverted to less important things. Our distractions can gobble up hours before we know it. Serious research has been conducted on, quote, the most distracted generation in human history. The attention span of children growing up in our media-saturated environment is decreasing significantly. A Pew Research Center study reports that 90% of 2,462 teachers believed digital technologies were creating, quote, an easily distracted generation with short attention spans. I'll wake you up. This is why this is really important. Attentiveness, and we've talked about this, the opposite of distraction. Attentiveness, distraction. Attentiveness, the opposite of distraction, broadens our field of vision to what matters. Who or what is worthy of our attention? To develop attentiveness and disperse distraction, though, requires an environment that sifts out influences that deflect our attention from what really counts. If our media-saturated environment is fomenting distraction on an unprecedented scale, an occasional media fast might be just the remedy to refocus our attention. And I did this at Eastern. I did this with my students in this class I taught there. And they went on, those who wanted to do so, went on an extended media fast for 9 weeks. Yeah. Even the school newspaper wrote about it. Because everybody was so fascinated, why would someone do something like this? Here are some of the outcomes I gleaned from their journaling, because I had them journal about the experience. Better sleep patterns, lower levels of anxiety, increased spiritual sensitivity, more face-to-face time with other students. Students reported greater attentiveness to God and to their environment. Some commented they never realized they had so much time to study. Not all students who began the fast completed it. For some, the silence was just too difficult. Others simply missed their social media too much. But most students, even those who fasted for only a few days, felt that their fast was a positive experience. I remember one student said at the end of the semester, Dr. Hall, I'm not going to continue the fast, but I plan on occasional media fasts in the future. It really changed my life. I never realized how quiet the world can be. Now, positively speaking, so the metaphor of misery markers came to mind, and then the metaphor of beacon lights on a different way came to mind. Beacon lights. So here are some beacon lights tuck these away as you reread the book in the future, which I expect you to do. Here are some beacon lights. Just imagine a beacon light shining on different aspects of spiritual formation. So healthy spiritual formation burns grace, in Dallas Willard's wonderful phrase, like a 747 burns fuel on takeoff. Get that plane up in the air, it's burning fuel. Imagine you burning fuel like that. And the fuel is the grace of God. Healthy spiritual formation is God-centered, not self-centered. It focuses its attention on the beauty and wonder of God revealed to us in Jesus. It assumes a posture of open hands and open heart, eager to receive the abundance God longs to give. All you're doing when you're receiving something as a gift is you just put your hands out. Or you take the top of your head off and let your mind receive a gift from God. Healthy spiritual formation refreshes and exhilarates. It focuses on training, not trying. That is a Renovari slogan. Training, not trying. It never judges others and refuses to condemn. That's a big desert principle too. So truckloads of grace. Just imagine that. Every once in a while you just take the truck down to the grace filling station and fill her up. All spiritual growth begins with grace, is nurtured by grace, and reaches maturity through grace. Spiritual formation is not a self-help program for change. Indeed, the spiritually formed image bearer has already admitted that she needs truckloads of grace from outside the self if lasting change is ever to occur. Or to change metaphors, if we ever switch off the grace switch, we're in trouble. We'll quickly run out of power. Understanding the dynamics of grace is tricky business. Why? Image bearers, particularly Protestant ones, tend to equate exertion in our spiritual lives with, quote, works righteousness. We're quick to affirm that we're saved by grace alone, yet to practice a spiritual discipline, each one a means of grace that God uses to grow us in love, involves, these are good words now, involves determination, engagement, and effort. I don't talk about determination, engagement, and effort in this chapter until I'm about halfway through. Because it's not safe to talk about those words unless we got the grace switch fully engaged. See my point? None of the disciplines are practiced passively. Let go and let God is a poor metaphor for the spiritual life. Yet we earn nothing from God when we practice a spiritual discipline. Nothing. We're simply growing in grace. But God likes to use concrete means in people's lives. I might even talk about that next week. I just don't know. I'm working on it. Henry Nouwen encourages us to view our lives with God as both a gift and a responsibility. This quote, the spiritual life is a gift. It's the gift of the Holy Spirit, who lifts us up into the kingdom of God's love. But to say that being lifted up into the kingdom of love is a divine gift does not mean that we wait passively until the gift is offered to us. Food for thought. Next section I called an invitation to play in the field of God's grace. I think this is an important part to read. It'll make you, hopefully it'll make you smile. I've sometimes heard Christians refer to what is spiritual and what is worldly. You've heard that distinction, I think. It's fair to a certain extent. Spiritual people do spiritual things and avoid worldly things. In the late 19th century and up through the 1950s, many Christians believed that playing cards, smoking, drinking, and going to movies were worldly activities. Today, many Christians would not consider these activities worldly, though most would agree that smoking and overdrinking can surely harm our health. My concern is that we may mislabel perspectives and practices as worldly that are actually spiritual. And by doing so, set up misery markers that do no one any good. God might well love fun and play more than some spiritual people do. Consider the millions of creatures God has created, all of them described as good in the Genesis creation accounts. A recent study estimates that the world contains 8.7 million species. Cataloging them all would take more than 1,000 years. All of these creatures, reptiles, bugs, birds, mammals, amphibians, single-cell creatures, are God's creation, God's delight. God enjoys variety. God evidently likes wild things, color, teeth, bones, blood, wings, feathers, fins, roaring, buzzing. The list of things God enjoys seems endless. What was God thinking when he created a zebra? A giraffe? A volcano? A star? An albatross? A lion? A cobra? A butterfly, an ostrich, an amoeba, a platypus. Just yesterday, I enjoyed a film of dolphins frolicking with humpback whales off the coast of Australia. I just watched it and then wrote about it. By all appearances, these wondrous creatures were simply having fun. The whales were trying to whack the dolphins with their tails as the dolphins dodged effortlessly. Both whales and dolphins continued the dodge and miss game a long time. Each attempt and each miss seemed to bring delight to all. If whales can chuckle, I think they were doing so. I could hear the dolphins clicking to each other. Were they laughing? Or cheering each other on? Why should this surprise us? Here's the question. What might these frolicking creatures teach us about God? And about what God offers to enrich our what God offers us to enrich our spiritual lives and our relationship with Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Now listen up. By circumscribing spiritual activities in too narrow a way, we weaken, not strengthen ourselves. I think of the many pastors and priests who are spiritually, emotionally, and physically exhausted. They're burning out at an unprecedented rate. Might a trip to the zoo re-energize them? Or a trip to the ballpark? Fatigue weakens our resistance to temptation and other hazards of the spiritual life. Agnes Sanford writes of the pastor who fell into adultery when all he really wanted to do was play golf. Might not God enjoy accompanying this pastor for a round of golf? Can you imagine playing golf with Jesus? If that's stretching your imagination, that's a good thing. A desire to stroll down a fairway, whacking a little white ball mutates for this pastor into an adulterous affair with all its accompanying carnage. Willard warns, quote, "To cut off the joys and pleasures associated with our bodily and social existence as unspiritual, then can actually have the effect of weakening us in our efforts to do what is right. It makes impossible for us to see and draw strength from the goodness of rightness." In light of time, I'll just leave the blessing of childlikeness, which I've been writing about a little bit here, to you and G.K. Chesterton. Yeah. I'm going to take us now to the last page. Turn over to page 285. The slowest of all human movements. When I got to this point, I was praying, Lord, help me to tie this up. Lord, help me to tie it up. Some things just take time, and spiritual formation is one of them. It can't be rushed. Imagine a 5-year-old child wishing she was 15. Wish though she might, 15 is still 10 years away. A 30-year-old baby Christian just starting out in his relationship with Christ might long to have the depth and wisdom of someone who's been walking with Jesus on a different way for 40 years. But the wish is no more realistic than that of our 5-year-old child. As a wise mentor told me some 35 years ago, Chris, spiritual formation is the slowest of all human movements. I remember how relieved I was to hear this wise word, for things were taking so long. Was there something wrong with me? Surely I remember thinking, I should be beyond this sinful habit or character flaw by now. After all, I've been working on this for 3 months. When I learned that spiritual formation is a very, very slow process, I embraced the freedom to be patient with myself and with others. Just as there are specific times, seasons, and rhythms for physical growth, the same is true for spiritual growth. Almost every character we encounter in the pages of the Bible grows over years, not over days or months, and may seem unaware of any growth occurring. So I mentioned a number that you might want to take a look at there. This pattern remains true for us. The Lord knows us better than we know ourselves. He knows the weak spots, the recurring temptations, the sinful habits, the roadblocks to love. He perceives a destination and transformation for each of us that we rarely discern clearly. Because we're so directly involved, it's hard for us to spot where and when the growing is happening. Thus, the importance of patience with ourselves and with God. Now, I remember this very specifically from my own life. I remember a conversation I had with a friend who had not seen me for a long stretch. She'd known me when I first started my relationship with Jesus, and when we crossed paths a few years later, she spotted growth I'd never noticed. "You've changed," she said in the course of our conversation. "Really?" I asked somewhat skeptically. "Yeah, oh yes. Now you can love. When I first met you, you couldn't." Her words encouraged me and gave me hope. All right, last 3 paragraphs of the book. Our journey together on a different way has drawn to a close, at least in the pages of this book. as I say goodbye, one last reminder that love is the principal means of spiritual growth, the mark of a maturing Christian, and the goal toward which we are called by the Holy Trinity. We grow by loving, and every spiritual discipline helps us to love more deeply. As we keep in step with Jesus, we look more and more like him, think more and more like him, act more and more like him, for we are his precious image bearers. Our footsteps match his ever more faithfully. We stumble fewer times. By God's grace, people see him in us and are blessed in the seeing. For Jesus is the greatest lover in the universe. As we continue our pilgrimage of Christ into the future, our love grows and matures. For we're finite creatures, and our traveling companion is both human and divine. Jesus' love, like that of the Father and the Spirit, is boundless. It's infinite. And when a finite image bearer travels with the incarnate Son, our capacity to give and receive love continues to expand. This is what the future holds for us. Each moment, a new taste of God's immense, intense love, and the pathway to this wonder and beauty is a different way. I'm going to ask you to do something. This Christmas season, think of folks who could be helped by hearing that. Folks in your life, acquaintances, friends who could be helped by hearing that, and get them the book. God bless you all.